Hello, I'm Essay, your AI essayist. Please note that all content, audio and video in this presentation are AI generated. As AI can sometimes produce inaccuracies, I encourage you to verify any factual information presented. With that in mind, let's begin. A world remade by fire and steel demanded a new map, and in the gilded Hall of Mirrors at Versailles in 1919, the victorious powers gathered to draw its borders. Amidst the statesmen and generals, a younger, brilliant mind from the British Treasury, John Maynard Keynes, watched with a growing sense of intellectual horror. He saw the unfolding negotiations, ostensibly about securing a lasting peace, as an exercise in vengeful arithmetic, a political fantasy built upon a foundation of economic impossibility. The atmosphere was thick with the hubris of victory, a conviction that the old certainties of the 19th century, the self-regulating market, the unshakable gold standard, the moral imperative of balanced ledgers, would simply reassert themselves once the ink was dry. Keynes perceived something else entirely, the sowing of seeds for a future, more devastating conflict. This prevailing economic orthodoxy was a formidable intellectual inheritance from the Edwardian and Victorian ages. It viewed the economy as a grand, intricate clockwork mechanism. If a part faltered, say, with rising unemployment, the price of that part, wages, would fall until equilibrium was restored. The system was believed to possess an innate tendency toward balance and full employment, guided by the rational calculations of countless individuals pursuing their own interests. Government's role was to be a fastidious caretaker, ensuring the currency was soundly backed by gold and that the state's own budget remained in surplus. To interfere, to meddle with the gears through large-scale public spending or deliberate deficit financing was considered an economic sin, a path toward profligacy and ruin. The Treaty of Versailles, in Keynes's estimation, was the ultimate expression of this worldview's fatal flaw, its complete detachment from the material world. The demand for reparations from a shattered Germany was calculated with a punitive logic that ignored Germany's capacity to pay. The figures were astronomical, requiring the vanquished nation to generate immense export surpluses for decades. Keynes, with his sharp analytical mind, understood the brutal mechanics of international trade. For Germany to pay, it would have to flood world markets with cheap goods, outcompeting the very allied industries the treaty was meant to protect. The alternative was for Germany to acquire vast sums of foreign currency through loans, creating a pyramid of international debt that was bound to collapse. The victors were demanding a financial perpetual motion machine. They were legislating an economic contradiction, unable to countenance his government's participation in what he termed a Carthaginian peace. Keynes performed an act of profound intellectual rebellion. He resigned from the British delegation. He then retreated and, in a white heat of fury and clarity, wrote the economic consequences of the peace. Unleashed upon the world in late 1919, the book was an immediate sensation, a thunderclap of dissent. Its power came from its unique fusion of rigorous economic argument with searing literary prose and devastating character sketches of the Allied leaders. He painted Woodrow Wilson as a naive theologian lost in European power politics, and Georges Clemenceau as a cynical statesman obsessed solely with crushing a historic rival, with zero regard for the economic life of the continent. The work's central argument was that the entire European economy was an interdependent system. To cripple its industrial heart in Germany was to condemn the whole body to a prolonged sickness. He argued for the cancellation of inter-allied war debts and a massive coordinated reconstruction loan to restart the continental economy. This was a radical departure from the prevailing wisdom of every nation for itself. The book transformed Keynes from a brilliant but obscure treasury official into a global public intellectual. He had used the tools of economics as a polemical weapon, taking the debate out of the cloistered halls of power and presenting it directly to the public. He demonstrated that economic policy was a matter of life and death, too important to be left to the deluded calculations of politicians. This profound skepticism toward the established order had its roots in a much deeper, more abstract intellectual project that had occupied Keynes for years. His 1921 publication, A Treatise on Probability, though seemingly remote from the world of war reparations, provided the philosophical bedrock for his entire life's work. In it he mounted a fundamental challenge to the classical conception of risk. The economic theories of his day assumed that future events, while unknown, existed within a calculable framework of probability. Business decisions, investments and savings were all modeled as if people were making rational bets based on known odds, like players at a roulette table. Keynes proposed a powerful distinction. He separated quantifiable risk from a far more pervasive and unsettling condition, fundamental uncertainty. Risk is when you can calculate the odds. Uncertainty is when you have no logical basis for assigning any probability whatever. For Keynes, most of the consequential decisions in economic life, the choice to build a new factory, to launch a new enterprise, to invest for the long term, are made under the shadow of this deep uncertainty. The future is a fog, and human beings navigate it using what he would later famously call animal spirits. These are the spontaneous urges to action, the waves of optimism and pessimism, the instincts and conventions that guide behavior when rational calculation is impossible. The orthodox model of a rational calculating economic agent was, in Keynes's view, a fiction. Real economies were driven by these shifting tides of human psychology. This insight reframed the entire problem of economic stability. An economy governed by animal spirits, under conditions of deep uncertainty, could become paralyzed by fear or propelled by irrational exuberance. It possessed no inherent automatic mechanism to guarantee a return to a healthy equilibrium. The invisible hand could falter, gripped by panic. The critique in the economic consequences of the peace was therefore more than a technical argument about reparations. It was an early application of this worldview. The statesmen at Versailles were acting as if the future was a predictable ledger book, while Keynes saw that their actions were creating a vortex of uncertainty that would poison the animal spirits of European commerce for a generation. By the dawn of the 1920s, he stood as a prophetic and isolated figure. He had exposed the intellectual bankruptcy of the old order and articulated the deep philosophical reason for its fragility. The world would spend the next decade attempting to reconstruct the very system he had shown to be built on sand, setting the stage for a global economic calamity that would validate his darkest premonitions. That calamity arrived with a velocity and a depth that stunned even the most hardened pessimists. The financial crash of 1929 was the overture to a decade of economic paralysis, a global contagion that defied every prescription offered by the classical school of economics. The world witnessed a horrifying paradox. Factories stood silent, their machinery capable of immense production, while millions of willing men and women queued for bread. Fields lay fallow while populations went hungry. Capital, the lifeblood of enterprise, sat idle in bank vaults, terrified of the future. This was a spectacle of dysfunction on a scale previously unimaginable, and it presented an intellectual crisis as profound as the material one. The established economic wisdom, regnant for over a century, was anchored in a set of elegant, almost Newtonian, principles of equilibrium. Chief among these was Say's law, the deceptively simple axiom that supply creates its own demand. The very act of producing goods, the theory held, generated the income, wages, profits, rents necessary to purchase those goods. A general glut of products was a logical impossibility. Temporary mismatches might occur, but the price mechanism, particularly the flexibility of wages, would swiftly restore balance. If unemployment rose, wages would fall until it became profitable to hire everyone again. The system was self-regulating, self-healing. Any government intervention, especially deficit spending, would only distort these natural corrective forces, prolonging the agony. The proper response to a downturn, according to this orthodoxy, was patience, austerity, and balanced budgets. It was a creed that demanded faith in the market's inherent capacity to find its way back to health. Throughout the early 1930s, this creed was tested in the cruelest laboratory imaginable, and it failed catastrophically. As governments across the world, from Herbert Hoover's America to Ramsay MacDonald's Britain, hewed to the principles of fiscal rectitude, economies spiraled further downward. Wage cuts failed to stimulate hiring, they merely reduced purchasing power, deepening the crisis. The invisible hand appeared to be paralyzed, or worse, to be actively strangling the patient it was meant to revive. For Keynes, observing from Cambridge and London, this was the ultimate vindication of his lifelong skepticism about the elegant but brittle architecture of classical thought. The real world, in all its messy psychological complexity, had finally shattered the idealized model. The fundamental assumption of rational, self-correcting markets was being falsified daily on the streets of every major industrial nation. From the position of a powerful critic, Keynes transitioned into the role of an architect of recovery. He saw the affliction in fundamentally different terms. The core problem was a collapse of what he would later formalize as aggregate demand. The collective desire and ability to spend by consumers and, crucially, by investors had evaporated. The animal spirits of capitalism, that vital instinctual urge to take a chance on the future, had fled. In their place was a profound and rational preference for liquidity, a desperate scramble to hold cash in the face of overwhelming uncertainty. Savings were being hoarded, severing the link that classical economists assumed automatically connected them to investment. The economy was caught in a vicious feedback loop. Falling spending led to lower production, which led to higher unemployment, which led to even lower spending. It had found an equilibrium, a terrifyingly stable state of persistent stagnation. His immediate response was a series of forceful public interventions through essays, radio broadcasts, and direct advice to policymakers. In his 1933 pamphlet, The Means to Prosperity, he laid out the argument with startling clarity. With private investment moribund, the only entity capable of breaking the cycle was the state. He called for a deliberate program of large-scale loan-financed public expenditure. The government should build roads, houses, electrify the nation, anything to inject new purchasing power into the economy. This was a direct heretical assault on the Treasury view, the prevailing British doctrine that public works would simply crowd out private investment, diverting a finite pool of savings with no net benefit. Keynes's insight was to see that this doctrine was entirely invalid in a situation of mass unemployment. The resources for public works, the labor, the materials, the capital, were lying idle. Government spending would put them back to work, creating new income where there was none. This new income would then be spent, creating further income for others in a cascading effect. The logic was powerful and intuitive. To pay a man to dig a hole and another to fill it back in, while seemingly absurd, was infinitely preferable to paying him a dole for doing nothing at all. The former action created a ripple of economic activity. The latter perpetuated stagnation. He argued that the fear of national debt was profoundly misplaced in such a context. A government, unlike a household, could be a debtor to its own citizens. The debt incurred to finance recovery would be dwarfed by the wealth generated by a restored economy. The true profligacy, he contended, was the colossal daily waste of unemployed human potential and dormant industrial capacity. This advocacy placed him in direct opposition to the financial establishment of his day. His ideas were seen as fiscally irresponsible, a dangerous flirtation with inflation, and an unwarranted intrusion into the domain of private enterprise. His opponents saw the Depression as a necessary moral purge, a painful but essential correction for the excesses of the 1920s. Keynes viewed it as a technical problem of macroeconomic management, a flaw in the engine of the economy that could be repaired with the right tools. The debate was a clash of two fundamentally different conceptions of capitalism, one as a moral system governed by immutable laws, the other as a complex machine that sometimes required a skilled mechanic. His proposals resonated with a public desperate for solutions, and they found some purchase in the policies of Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal in the United States and in the more modest public works programs of other nations. Yet Keynes understood that policy advocacy alone was insufficient. His arguments, while compelling, were still attacks on a deeply entrenched and theoretically coherent worldview. To truly win the intellectual war, he needed more than pamphlets and polemics. He needed to dismantle the entire classical edifice, axiom by axiom, and erect a new, comprehensive theory in its place. He had diagnosed the illness and prescribed a cure. Now he had to write the full medical textbook, explaining the complete anatomy and physiology of a modern economy in a way that accounted for the disease of mass unemployment. This monumental task would consume him for the next several years, culminating in the single most influential book of economics of the 20th century. The intellectual labor that followed produced, in 1936, the General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money. This was a volume of formidable difficulty, dense with novel terminology and intricate chains of reasoning. It was a deliberate break from the past, a book intended for his fellow economists, aiming to revolutionize the fundamental axioms of their science. Keynes sought to furnish a completely new analytical apparatus, a grammar for understanding why a complex market economy could become trapped in a state of persistent stagnation. The work's ambition was immense, to construct from first principles a model that explained the world as it was, a world of uncertainty, volatile expectations, and the very real possibility of prolonged involuntary unemployment. The entire classical system rested on a foundation known as Say's law, the proposition that the act of producing goods, supply concurrently generates the income necessary to purchase them. The process was seen as a closed, self-correcting loop. Keynes inverted this logic entirely. He posited that the level of employment and overall economic output was determined by the total spending, or aggregate demand, within the economy. This principle of effective demand became the cornerstone of his new framework. Aggregate demand was the sum of three components: consumption spending by households, investment spending by businesses, and spending by the government. The central drama of the economy unfolded in the relationship between these flows. Consumption, he argued, was a relatively stable function of income. He articulated what he termed a fundamental psychological law: as a community's real income increases, its consumption also increases, although by a smaller amount. The fraction of an additional dollar of income that is spent, he called the marginal propensity to consume. This seemingly simple observation held a profound consequence, which Keynes developed into one of his most powerful analytical tools, the multiplier effect. Because households save a portion of any new income, a single injection of spending sets off a chain reaction of diminishing subsequent spending rounds. The genius of Keynes was to provide a precise mathematical expression for this cascade. A change in autonomous spending, for instance, a government decision to build a new dam or a business decision to construct a new factory, would produce a magnified impact on total national income. The size of this multiplier was a direct function of the marginal propensity to consume. It is calculated as 1 divided by the quantity of 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. If, for example, the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8, meaning 80 cents of every new dollar is spent, the multiplier is 5. A £100 million investment would therefore generate £500 million in total national income as the money was spent and respent throughout the economy. Here was a quantitative, predictable relationship that explained how changes in investment or government policy could have such dramatic effects on overall employment and prosperity. Having established the mechanics of demand, Keynes turned his attention to the most volatile and psychologically driven component of all investment. Classical theory held that the savings of households would flow smoothly into business investment, with the interest rate acting as the balancing mechanism. A surplus of savings would cause interest rates to fall, encouraging businesses to borrow and invest more, thus ensuring all savings were put to productive use. Keynes saw this as a profound misreading of reality. He introduced a radical theory of interest, grounded in what he called liquidity preference. He argued that people hold money for 3 reasons: for daily transactions, as a precaution against unforeseen needs, and for speculation. This speculative motive was the truly revolutionary insight. It suggested that individuals and firms might choose to hoard cash, to remain liquid, if they are uncertain about the future or if they anticipate that interest rates will rise, which would cause the price of existing bonds to fall. This desire for liquidity could sever the link between saving and investment. The interest rate in Keynes's world was the price of money itself. It was the reward for parting with the security of cash. It was determined in the money market by the supply of money and the public's demand to hold it. Investment, meanwhile, was governed by something else entirely: the volatile and often irrational expectations of entrepreneurs about future profitability. Keynes famously ascribed these forward-looking decisions to animal spirits, a spontaneous urge to action rather than inaction, and a reliance on convention and gut feeling in the face of an unknowable future. An economy could therefore find itself in a ruinous trap. If animal spirits were low and liquidity preference was high, businesses would refrain from investing while households hoarded their savings. The result would be a chronic shortfall in aggregate demand. This led to the book's most shocking and consequential conclusion: an economy could achieve a stable equilibrium with high levels of involuntary unemployment. The self-correcting forces celebrated by classical economists were weak or non-existent. An economy could languish indefinitely, its resources underutilized, its people out of work, with no inherent tendency to return to full employment. The system lacked a reliable internal thermostat. This concept of an unemployment equilibrium shattered the intellectual consensus of a century. It provided the theoretical justification for what people were observing with their own eyes during the Great Depression. The free market, left to its own devices, could produce outcomes that were both inefficient and socially calamitous. With the general theory, Keynes had forged a new intellectual arsenal. He had replaced the classical focus on supply with a dynamic theory of demand. He had provided a mathematical tool, the multiplier, to quantify the impact of spending. He had offered a sophisticated psychological explanation for financial markets and investment behavior. Most critically, he had demonstrated how an economy could get stuck. The book was a complete system, a new lens through which to view the entire economic landscape. It was a diagnosis of the pathology of unemployment, grounded in a rigorous and internally consistent theoretical structure. Having built this powerful engine of analysis, the stage was set for its application to the most pressing problems of the age: financing a global conflict and designing a durable economic order from its ashes. The crucible of the Second World War provided the first, and most urgent, test for this new economic philosophy. Theory, however elegant, required validation in the furnace of existential crisis. For Keynes, this meant a return to the heart of government, this time as an indispensable advisor to the British Treasury. The immediate problem was one of brute economic logistics. How could a nation finance a total war, diverting the vast majority of its productive capacity to armaments, while preventing the ruinous inflation that had crippled economies after the First World War? The sheer scale of government spending would inject enormous sums of money into the public's hands, while the availability of consumer goods would simultaneously plummet. The result was a classic inflationary gap, a tidal wave of purchasing power crashing against a vanishing shoreline of things to buy. His solution, outlined in the 1940 pamphlet How to Pay for the War, was a masterpiece of pragmatic genius, blending macroeconomic insight with a keen understanding of public morale. He proposed a system of compulsory savings, or what he termed deferred pay. A significant portion of every worker's earnings would be automatically channeled into special, blocked post office savings accounts. This money would be inaccessible for the duration of the conflict, but would be released in staggered installments once peace returned. The mechanism was elegant in its dual function. It immediately siphoned off the excess demand that threatened to ignite an inflationary spiral, stabilizing the wartime economy. Concurrently, it gave every citizen a tangible financial stake in the future victory and reconstruction. This accumulated wealth would then serve as a stimulus to power the post-war recovery, providing the consumer demand needed to transition factories from producing bombers back to building automobiles and refrigerators. It was a tool for managing the economic cycle on a national scale, a direct application of his theoretical framework to the most severe practical challenge imaginable. With the tide of the war turning, Keynes's attention pivoted toward an even grander intellectual challenge, the construction of a global economic system that would secure a lasting peace. He and his contemporaries were haunted by the memory of the 1920s and 1930s, a period defined by economic nationalism, punitive reparations, competitive currency devaluations, and collapsing international trade, a chaotic environment that had cultivated the ground for conflict. In 1944, delegates from 44 Allied nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, with the monumental task of designing a new international monetary order. Keynes, despite his failing health, arrived as the towering intellectual figure of the conference, the leader of the British delegation. He brought with him a blueprint of breathtaking ambition. At its core was a proposal for an international clearing union, or ICU. This would function as a kind of global central bank, overseeing a new international reserve asset he called the Bancor. The value of the Bancor would be fixed in terms of gold, and it would be the unit of account for all international transactions. Each member country would have an overdraft facility with the ICU, its size proportional to its share of world trade. The system's true innovation lay in its elegant self-correcting mechanism for dealing with trade imbalances. A country running a trade deficit could settle its debts by drawing upon its Bancor account. A country running a persistent surplus, however, would accumulate a large Bancor balance. Here was the radical element of Keynes's plan. He designed the system to place equal, if symmetric, pressure on both debtor and creditor nations to adjust. Debtors would need to manage their economies to reduce deficits. Crucially, though, creditors with large, idle Bancor surpluses would also face incentives to act. Their surplus balances would be charged a negative interest rate, encouraging them to spend their earnings. They could do this by increasing imports from the deficit countries, by investing their capital abroad, or by providing international aid. This automatic rebalancing would prevent creditor nations from hoarding the world's liquidity and forcing the entire burden of adjustment onto the weaker debtor economies, a dynamic he believed was a primary cause of global deflation and instability. It was a system designed for mutual prosperity and continuous global growth. The final Bretton Woods Agreement, however, reflected the geopolitical realities of a world where American economic power was ascendant. The American plan, championed by Harry Dexter White of the U.S. Treasury, was a more conservative vision. It established the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, institutions that have shaped the global economy ever since. It rejected the Bancor and the automatic rebalancing mechanism, instead enshrining the US dollar, convertible to gold at a fixed rate, as the world's primary reserve currency. This arrangement placed the United States at the center of the system and shifted the primary burden of adjustment onto deficit countries. Keynes fought valiantly for his vision of a symmetric cooperative system, but the weight of American influence was overwhelming. Though he secured some concessions, he left Bretton Woods with a sense of profound disappointment, believing the world had settled for a system with the same structural flaws that had plagued the old gold standard. Keynes's death in 1946 came as the post-war world he had worked so tirelessly to shape was beginning to take form. For the next quarter-century, his ideas appeared triumphant. The period from roughly 1950 to 1973 is often called the Golden Age of Capitalism, or the era of the Keynesian consensus. Western governments actively managed their economies using fiscal and monetary policy to maintain full employment and stable growth. Recessions were brief and shallow, living standards rose dramatically, and comprehensive welfare states expanded. It seemed that Keynes had indeed provided the intellectual toolkit to tame the business cycle and create a more humane, stable form of capitalism. This consensus fractured in the 1970s. The simultaneous appearance of high unemployment and high inflation, a phenomenon known as stagflation, presented a challenge that the simplified Keynesian models of the day struggled to explain. This intellectual vacuum created an opening for alternative economic philosophies, particularly the monetarism of Milton Friedman and the broader neoliberal revival, which argued for deregulation, privatization, and a reduced role for the state in the economy. For a generation, Keynes's name became associated with outdated policies of profligate government spending and inflationary excess. Yet, the story of his influence possesses a remarkable cyclical quality, mirroring the economic cycles he sought to understand. The global financial crisis of 2008 triggered a stunning and widespread rehabilitation of his work. As financial markets seized up and the world economy teetered on the brink of another Great Depression, governments across the globe instinctively reached for the Keynesian playbook. They enacted massive fiscal stimulus packages, bailed out critical financial institutions, and engaged in active demand management on a scale unseen for decades. Commentators spoke of the return of the masters. His core insights about fundamental uncertainty, the psychological drivers of markets, and the potential for an economy to become trapped in a state of prolonged underemployment felt startlingly prescient. Ultimately, the enduring legacy of John Maynard Keynes lies in the fundamental question he posed to civilization. His life's work was a sustained and brilliant argument that the fate of our economies is a matter of choice, a thing to be managed by collective intelligence. He dismantled the comforting 19th-century belief in a self-regulating market that would always find its own equilibrium. In its place, he offered a more complex, more unsettling, and more realistic vision of an economic system prone to fits of irrationality and capable of producing immense social distress. He gave us the analytical tools to diagnose these pathologies
and the policy instruments to treat them. His work remains a permanent invitation to pragmatic action, a call to use human reason to shape our economic destiny for the better. The world continues to wrestle with the very instabilities he identified, ensuring that his voice, a unique blend of mathematical rigor, literary grace, and profound humanism, remains an essential part of the conversation.
We really appreciate you tuning in to this AI-powered presentation. Our goal is to push the boundaries of AI in content creation, and your input is invaluable. If there's a particular subject you'd like to see us tackle next, or if you have suggestions on how we could fine-tune our AI's creative prompts, please don't hesitate to leave your ideas in the comments section. We're excited to bring you more unique content very soon.